Calls to prevent violence in a popular area in Uptown. Charlotte City Council leader Bokhari is calling for the creation of a crime task force. This is all in response to a New Year's Eve shooting at Romeo Bearden Park that left 5 people injured. It's also an area that saw many similar incidents last year.
Joining us now, Chief Legal Analyst Khalif Rhodes, to take a closer look. Will this proposal help address some of the problems plaguing the city?
Well, I can say this, and I reached out to Bokhari on this matter, and so I know where his heart is, and I know what his intention is to ensure that there is someone speaking for the citizens of the city that believe that the violence is getting out of control. But I also can say that I've been on a number of task force in a number of my previous roles. When I was the chief magistrate, we had about 40 different task force, and so while I can appreciate that the task force always has good intentions, what I always weary of what happens down the road after we talk about things in the room. We have something called CJAC here, which is like all of the local leaders in the criminal justice system, talking about the sheriff, the police department, the judges, the attorneys, and they're all in this room, and they're making decisions on a high level, but on the lower level, things really don't trickle down to it actually happening. And so that's what I'm awfully mindful of when you come up with these decisions. The implementation of these decisions is really where the disconnect is. You really don't need another task force. You need another group making sure that you're implementing the numerous task force that are already out there.
Well, and part of the problem that I know Bokhari is talking about is yeah, there are some one-off crimes that are happening, but you got repeat offenders, you got teens that aren't being held accountable, and it just seems like it's been a slap on the wrist. Well, so how do you take care of that going forward?
It just depends on what step in the process where we're at. And so a lot of times it's confusing within the criminal justice system because people want accountability in the early on process. And what happens in the beginning of a criminal justice process is something called due process. And that typically favors the defendant because you have a constitutional right to a speedy trial. You have a constitutional right to not sit in prison while you wait in some capacity because we don't have a detention statute in our state. And so because of that, that due process normally leans more to the defendant. But then when you get throughout the process and say you're convicted, now the justice portion leads towards the victim, where you'll have some accountability in terms of sentencing, whether this person will be in the community for their sentence or go to prison for their sentence. But most of the time, folks are wanting that person to be punished before they go through the due process of even being convicted. And so that's where we see the disconnect when folks are saying, well, they're repeat offenders. Well, maybe their first case was dismissed, so now they're out and they have been charged but never convicted. And as I mentioned, because we don't have a detention statute, you have an obligation to release mostly everyone, except for a person that's charged with a homicide in our state. Everyone else has to have a bond set in some condition. They don't have to have one set for a homicide. And so when folks talk about people coming in and out of our jail system, it's because our statutes are written where we have a requirement for them to do that. I contrast that with some states that don't. There are some states out there that actually have detention statutes that say, you know what, this person, I want to detain them and I want them to sit in there until they go to trial. Our state doesn't do that. So how do you address that? Maybe the General Assembly. But it's not something that's done on a local level, and it's clearly not something that's done on the court level.
Well, and it's not an easy
It's definitely not an easy fix.
No. So.
But I will say that a task force where you're fine-tuning and narrowing down how you can address some of these microscopic issues, I'm all in favor of it. I'm just saying what happens after that, the implementation needs just as much effort and it just needs just as much funding to ensure that it gets done.